family of God is essentially motherless is not that women stop looking for a mother. They go and find a mother outside of the local church in the form of someone who they can find in a virtual space.
I think some elders operate, some pastors, not all, operate with a paradigm that has a view of men and women that I think negatively affects their shepherding.
I guess it helps us to see that we shouldn't be calibrating the biblical teaching to counterbalancing a cultural narrative, because the Bible itself is the norm.
Right.
The Bible itself is telling us what we should be doing.
It's the beautiful story.
It's the beautiful story.
Welcome to the Gospel Coalition Podcast, equipping the next generation of believers, pastors, and church leaders to shape life and ministry around the gospel. Today is a special episode titled Partners in Ministry, How Men and Women Must Labor Together for the Good of the Church.
Welcome to the Gospel Coalition Podcast. My name is Collin Hansen. I serve as the editor-in-chief of the Gospel Coalition, and we've got a very exciting topic today, Partners in Ministry, How Men and Women Can Labor Together for the Good of the Church. I'm excited about this conversation in part because you often hear about the problems or the limitations, but we're going to be talking especially about the positives, about encouragements and ways that we see God working well between men and women in the church today. I'm joined by some good friends here. Why don't you guys go ahead, Jen, start with us, introduce yourself, and just keep going around.
I'm Jen Wilkin, and I'm an author and Bible teacher and have served in the local church nigh on these many long years.
40.
My name is Kori Porter. I work in background in campus ministry and right now in nonprofit life.
I'm Mike Kruger. I'm president and professor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina.
So there are many things that we all share in common. There are ways that we would be different from each other as well. But one of the areas that we share in common within the Gospel Coalition is sharing a broad complementarian perspective that the office of pastor and elder is reserved for qualified men. And at the same time, we all agree that the body of Christ functions best when all of its members are valued and encouraged to use their gift. You know, often these conversations are about what women can't do. Many of the denominational debates that we see are often focused on the things that women cannot do. And those can be important discussions, but we also want to continually affirm all the many, many things that God has called women to do in the church and alongside men. So I just want to start with the basic question of how would you make the case that the church needs the ministry of women? And I thought, Mike, that we begin with you and just look at a historical perspective. One of the things that you teach and you're an expert in is the early church. Talk about that. Maybe even just bridge from the Bible.
Yeah.
Some of the biblical examples are a little bit more well-known, but bridge from that into the early church.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited about this conversation because even in a few hours from now, I'll be doing a whole talk on why we need women in ministry, and actually deals with a lot of the same issues here. And that whole talk is designed to be an encouragement along the same lines we're discussing here, which is that men and women need each other, and that is what complementarianism is about, right? So some people take complementarianism as a way of saying, let's separate men and women from each other in ministry. They don't really interact. I'm like, well, no, it's the opposite. We fit together. We need each other, and that's true from the very beginning. And it's true in the early church. As you noted, I've done a good bit of work on particularly second century Christianity, and I was rather shocked. In the academic space, you're not shocked by many things, but I thought I knew what was going on there, and I was shocked by just how many women were popping up in the historical sources all over the place. And in my talk this afternoon, I'll mention a bunch of them. But one example, in very early second century, as Christianity is spreading, some pagan governors, Pliny the Younger, is really upset about Christianity spreading. He's looking to find a couple Christians to torture and find out what's really going on in these secret meetings. And we're told in the historical record that it's two women he finds. It's just very fascinating that the two people he picks to get more information about Christianity are women, because women were flocking to it in great numbers. So what you see in the very beginning is that in the early Christian church, women were involved in all kinds of exciting and positive ways. And I want to make sure we just keep that in mind as we think about those issues today.
When I teach in cultural apologetics, one of the second sessions that I lead, we focus on persecution in the early church and tell the story of Perpetua and Felicity, which was one of Augustine's favorite stories to go back to and tell.
There's a lot of female martyrs that people don't know about,
Exactly. So two of the more well-known ones there. Jen, I think we need to frame this as this contribution of women is essential. It's not just something that's nice to have. It's not just optional. It's not just sort of a bonus, but help us understand by describing what makes it essential. Like, you can't have a well-functioning local church unless you're seeing women contribute in these ways.
Well, I was actually sitting here ready to edit the title of this session already because it says how men and women can labor together, and I would change it to how they must. Because the contributions of women are sometimes viewed as being nice but not necessary. You think about, in particular, the things that happen in the all pink spaces. It's like, well, that's whatever they want to do over there. And I think in a lot of cases, the all female space can suffer from a benign neglect from church leadership, which is male, because it's like, well, we don't really understand what's happening there, and we're happy as long as the women are happy. It's not seen as a spiritual formation environment so much as it is just a place for women to gather. That would just be one example, but I think what we're seeing in the New Testament one and others is exactly that there should be interaction happening in ministry spaces between men and women. We shouldn't have things just parsed into two different categories. And if you think about the way that Jesus speaks about the church when his mother and brothers come looking for him in the Gospels, he looks around at the people who are sitting under his teaching. He says, "Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters?" Anyone who does the will of the Father. So he describes the church as the family of God. And I worry that too often we have families in our local churches that if it was a nuclear family attending our church, we'd be very concerned about. We have a father who sets the rules, we have children who toe the line, and we have an absentee mother. So when we think about just a healthy family structure, we would expect that in our local churches, which are expressions of the family of God, that we would see fathers and mothers operating in that space. And again, as you mentioned, we would all agree at this table that the role of pastor elder is reserved for qualified men. But what we often see in local church expressions is something that we would be concerned about if we saw just an actual family that operated along those lines.
I'll add something to that if I can, because I think the familial analogy is such a great illustration of what we're talking about here. You mentioned, Jen, you got a sort of a very prominent father and an absentee mother as an analogy of the church. I would say there's another analogy you could use here, is that we wouldn't want sort of normal families to have two fathers and no mothers.
Right. Or
two mothers and no fathers. In fact, we've been seeing this in our society for years, and we're like, no, families need both the father and a mother to have the right balance and perspective. Well, that's also true in the church, right? Because we're a big family. So, whether it's a father that's prominent and a mother that's absent, but also you don't want a church that's only fathers because you end up with another imbalance there. So I think that familial analogy is key.
Often I feel like the case for women in the church has seemed more to be, like you said, like what we cannot do versus what we can do. But when I was going to seminary, what I realized was in the garden, how beautiful it is that I was taught under being Glad. Dr. Glad does a great job of explaining that the temple aspect of the garden and how we were put in together as co-laborers, right? And the first time we ever hear God's eternal voice say out amongst his creation, "It is not good," is in the absence of woman, right? And so what does that mean? It means that both male and female together partnering expresses the full image of God in the ministry or in the temple. And so we are the church, the temple here on earth today. We want to express that fullness of God, of us co-laboring together. So I do think that it's essential. The case, I think, is authored by God, established by God, and then shows itself throughout redemptive history and even branching out into, as he said, the second century church today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the solution to Adam's aloneness is not an elder board. It's a woman. So, and I'm not saying, that it isn't important for us to have elder boards, but I think we see, I think the problem that you run into when the family of God is essentially motherless is not that women stop looking for a mother. They go and find a mother outside of the local church in the form of someone who they can find in a virtual space. And I think sometimes what I wish more church leaders understood was that when you reach that moment, you actually have no idea which voices these women are being influenced by. I'm one of them. I hope I'm a credible, remote church mother, but I can't be an embodied church mother for the women in your church which is also not to say that the only benefit of having embodied church mothers is for the women in your church, in the same way that in the home, a mother has an important influence on sons. We need to have visible church mothers functioning in the local church.
I guess it wasn't the solution to Adam, but it was kind of the solution to Moses' problems. The plurality.
But you know what's interesting?
Go ahead.
Is that in Exodus 18, do you know what his father-in-law says to him? He says, this thing you're doing is not good. And then he gives him helpers. And so it's actually a parallel, I think, to the Genesis account.
Well, let's go back to an area that you and I have talked about, Jen, offline, different areas. And I think it undergirds a lot of this conversation. When we look back on the biblical narrative, going back to Genesis, do we see the similarities between men and women emphasized, or their differences emphasized? Want to jump in here?
Well, I mean, we see both,
Sure.
but I think it matters the order in which we see them. And even as recently as a few months ago, I saw an article that was written that talked about how Genesis chapter 2 is showing us this beautiful picture of male-female difference. But if you look at what Genesis chapter 2 is doing, basically Adam is shown a parade of animals that go in front of him who have been each created according to its kind. And so I actually have a secret pet theory that that's potentially the animals going by two, as they will in another section in Genesis, because he looks on them, and every time an animal goes by and he's giving them names, he's basically categorizing them. He's thinking, that one's not like me, that one's not according to my kind, not according to my kind. And then when Eve is created, he sings a hymn to sameness. He says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called Isha because she came from Ish. In other words, she shall be like me because she came from me. And so when we don't start with what we share, we have a tendency to over-focus on difference. And anytime you over-focus on difference, you're going to push people away. You're going to objectify people. This is what happens in other settings where I look at you and say, we have nothing in common. It's easier for me to push you down, to see you as just completely other than me. And the cultural narrative is men are from Mars, women are from Venus. The Genesis narrative is men are from the same garden created by the same God, tasked with the same cultural mandate, and made in the image of God together. So our differences matter. And in a day and age where differences are what are under attack, it's understandable that we would talk about them. But when we lose sight of sameness as the starting point, I think we devalue women in that conversation.
I think, Jen, you highlight a couple things there. Interesting, the men are from Mars, women are from Venus question. That is a dominant cultural narrative, but it's alongside the other cultural narrative, excuse me, that you just identified there. Mm-hmm. So there are some that push us in the we're different, and there are some that push us in we're basically the same, we're interchangeable in there, and those can all be overlapping. I guess it helps us to see that we shouldn't be calibrating the biblical teaching to counterbalancing a cultural narrative, because the Bible itself is the norm.
Right.
The Bible itself is telling us what we should be doing. It's the beautiful story. It's the beautiful story. And so it shouldn't be enough for us to say, well, the world's saying this, therefore we should say that. Well, the world will say this and that, but the Bible says this. And this is what God wants us to emphasize there. Related to that, I do want to find out what you guys think about gender-specific spaces. Let's talk about female-specific spaces here. Is that still valuable in this environment? I mean, we're talking about how they must work together, but is that still a place that we should be encouraging? And
Absolutely.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a female-only space, therefore, is a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. Like if I have a female-led space in campus ministry and being in parachurch, that's often the case, but we always congregate and come together and do fellowship together. So I really wouldn't understand why we would bifurcate the two and keep them separate. I would think that the benefit would be of having a female-led space and only space would be the vulnerability and the maturity and the ability to be able to see a woman model her vulnerability in a way that's safe, but then also you being able to also share and grow in that space. However, in the presence of men, that's not always as accessible for different reasons and may not be as comfortable. So I do think a female-led space and female-only space has its benefits, and it is pretty, I think, foundational to any woman's growth. And to Jen's point as well, I think I love the Gospel Coalition. I love the work that's being done. I think the downfall sometimes is in female spaces. We oftentimes only go to, like you said, the Jen Wilkins, the Jackie Hill Perrys, or the other big names, because we don't have access to women in our local congregation, because those women aren't being trained or equipped to be able to know how to successfully mentor other women, and those women, the older women, are oftentimes intimidated. So I think that space needs to not only be there, but needs to be cultivated by the pastor and be resourced so that the women have a better opportunity to grow and flourish in their local settings, as well as like national platforms and settings.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, it's not just whether there's distinctive female space, but what's the content of it? What's the nature of it? What's the purpose of it? I mean, it's funny to ask that question sitting here at the national conference, the Women's National Conference. This is distinctively a female space, and Collin and I walk around with 9,000 other women here, so we feel that pretty acutely.
Thank you for joining us in the estrogen pond. Yes,
I'm not gonna find a bathroom this year. I don't know. One year I couldn't find one, so they got taken over. But no, I think that's entirely legitimate. The question isn't whether groups do that, because I think you have men's ministry, women's ministry, you have youth ministry, you have other kinds. The question is, what is the purpose of it?
Right.
And the idea that it's just simply, well, we're going to teach men theology, but we're going to let our women just go and socialize. We're going to teach, our men theology, but let the youth, as another example of a broken off group, go and just play games all the time. I mean, any subgroup needs to be evaluated in terms of what we're trying to do there. And so discipleship has to be the centerpiece of all that. Now, that's not to say you want all those groups cordoned off all the time. We found this problem at the seminary level at RTS. We realized that because seminary is mostly men, when we have a women's only ministry at the seminary, it can sometimes even exacerbate the problem because they feel even more isolated.
Yeah.
So what we tried to do is do both. Allow them to have their opportunity to be together for obvious reasons, but also make sure we're working really hard to bring the male and female students together in spaces where they can interact with each other. And truthfully, when you're training pastors, they need to know how to interact with women in their churches. If you have a seminary environment that's supposed to train them and they're only interacting with their other guys, that actually isn't a very good training ground for what the real world's going to be when they get into churches.
Jen, you can come back later. Well, let's talk about that right now. Of Kori's point of how do we raise up and encourage other women teachers and leaders, so that alongside they're doing their Jen Wilkin studies, they're also learning themselves to teach. And I know this is your heart.
It is, absolutely. I don't want to be the head on the screen. That's the only female voice that women are hearing in the local church. It can be a starting point, but it shouldn't be the terminus for what churches are doing with their women.
And 15 years ago, there weren't nearly as many examples at a national level. There were some examples, but not nearly as many.
Yeah.
So it seems like we are making some progress there, but what's the next step look like?
Well, so it's not an all-female solution, right? Because the reality of the local church is, in a male-led local church, is that men are going to control access to budgets and calendars and to resources as well. And that sounds, I don't mean it to sound like control in a negative way. It's just the reality of the way most church organizations function. I know that my ability to receive good training, my ability to even have a room to talk to, was heavily related to whether there was a man in a ministry role who looked at what I was doing and said, this is valuable. Right. This is important. This is essential. It's not nice, but not necessary. And we need those door holders. And unfortunately, there's a lot of subtext running in a lot of our churches that says, Mike touched on this, says that shouldn't happen. And women pick up on this. We know if a male pastor or pastoral staff doesn't want to meet with us, but will meet with a man who's in a comparable role in the local church. And the reality, our theological reality is that a non-elder male is in the same space as a female in the local church. And so there should be access for a woman in the same way that there would be for any non-elder male. And so That's not always the case. And because I have had just an incredible gift in the male leaders that I've served under who have said, I value this and I want to not just amplify this, but I want to resource this person so she can do the job well. It's made all the difference in the world for me. Women need to see other women doing this, but that's not enough. A lot of women will go home from this national conference having seen women do something that they didn't even conceive of themselves doing, and they'll return to a church where a woman doing that is so low on the list of things that people care about that they'll meet with a lot of frustration. And I really believe it's why we see so many women operating in a parachurch space.
I do think there's a parallel to what happens to youth pastors as well. Even if they're a male on a pastoral staff, they're often regarded in the same way of simply not worthy of a lot of attention or investment there. I'm not feigning ignorance here. I truly am ignorant. I don't really understand how this happens, of why that neglect jumps in or what the fear is coming from there. Mike, let's we see especially a major problem in discipline cases in the church and problems where the leadership goes wrong. And that happens a lot. And one of the key areas where it goes wrong is between men and women. And if it's a discipline case that rises to a certain level, it's going to be the elders who are handling that. And those are going to be men, but they're all often going to involve women. I'm just blown away by the ignorance that I see, the confusion, the just dumb things that I see elders do. And I don't understand, why wouldn't women be included, consulted, even women on their own staff? Why would they proceed to make such dumb decisions?
Yeah.
Without even asking a woman for insight of how this might be received, where I can go ahead.
I see these cases all the time. It happens in discipline cases, happens in shepherding cases. It's not just discipline cases, but
I should have clarified
family's going
that.
through a crisis and you got to shepherd the family through it.
Yeah.
There does seem to be some real unawareness of the dynamics there that need attention as you have an all-male elder board and pastoral staff trying to address these complicated issues. So there's probably two layers of it. One layer, I think you can say why these things happen is genuine unawareness. I think there are well-intended pastors who are just not attuned to some of these dynamics that aren't necessarily nefarious in any fashion, but just simply
dumb is different from malicious.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't mean that it's always malicious.
And I'm not suggesting you meant that.
Yeah.
But I'll mention the second one, which I think is not just ignorance, but I think some elders operate, some pastors, not all, operate with a paradigm that has a view of men and women that I think negatively affects their shepherding. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, I see this all the time, is they think if you're going to shepherd a family, all you have to do is talk to the husband. Right. And if I'm a pastor, I just shepherd the husband, everything trickles down the food chain from there and all's well. And so women in that context are generally not even well known by the ministry, not even well known by the pastor, certainly not shepherded in any sort of meaningful way by the pastor. And everything is shielded behind other men for these women, so they're way down the pecking order. And I hear that philosophy all the time.
But Mike, that's even in a case when the man is the problem.
Oh,
in the
course,
situation.
Yes.
This is what I don't understand.
So if you want to evaluate the marriage, they ask the man. You're like, well, wait a second. You're asking half the marriage here. And let's be honest, men aren't always the most attuned at the sort of even the status of their own marriage. There's all kinds of interesting statistics where they quiz married couples about how you think your marriage is going, and men are like, I think it's about an 8, and most women are like, I think it's about a 3, and you're like, whoa, what explains that difference? And so if you go to a family and say, we're going to shepherd you through a marriage crisis, and you're going to go mainly funneling it through the man, you are missing a tremendous amount of things there. So I think there's some theological reasons for that are misguided for doing it that way, and I think that needs to be addressed. So.
Okay. Kori or Jen, have you seen any positive examples of where this works well, where men and women are working with each other, collaborating in those shepherding cases? Have you seen any examples of that?
Yeah, go ahead.
In my early ministry opportunities, I was involved in a church discipline case where another staff person was not just racially disrespectful, but also became sexually disrespectful. And it involved him and him bringing in a student in the involvement as well. And I think for years I had dealt with the disrespect with racial things, and just by pulling them aside and trying to go to my brother and trying to explain. And then it continued to escalate and snowball. And so as soon as it turned sexual, the pastor stepped in. He knew about the racial experiences, but I don't think he may have, it was a very white conservative context. I don't think he felt equipped possibly to know the nuances of that, if you will. But when it went sexual, he stepped in, called the elders, and the guy got disciplined. In the process of that, though, I think as the person that was offended, I think I was maybe overly consulted, and I think I wanted to be shepherded. I wanted to be protected. And I think, to your point, they didn't want to hurt me, and so they probably asked too much of my input. Whereas I wanted my elders and my pastors to be my pastors. I wanted protection. So it's not, is this too far? Is this okay, Kori? It kind of more feels like you're protecting yourself from a lawsuit than it does feel like you're actually genuinely, caring about my heart and my well-being and the way I'm processing the gospel at this moment. And so again, the Lord is gracious, and that particular person asked for forgiveness the first time, and I knew that he was kind of playing the game, and I said no. And then he came back and he said, whether you believe me or not, you saying no really made me look within myself and understand that I really was just trying to get out of trouble. And I really am repentant now, and I understand the ways in which I've disrespected you and transgressed against you. So I would ask that you would reconsider, and I did, and that was allowing for the Spirit to work, but in its time. And so I just think that case really showed me the inner workings of the church, but also, peer relationships, and then how that sets on you and how you then therefore see things moving forward.
So in a disciplined case, the shepherds can become a jury in some ways, and that can be very difficult to experience. Positive examples or other exhortations?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen positive examples. They came as a result of having to own very negative ones.
Yeah, that's what I assume will often be the case.
And that's what I would when you think about this in the local church, I talk to pastors about this occasionally, and they'll say, well, I'm sorry your church went through that. My church doesn't really have a problem with this. And I just think, you don't know that you're, because we know that abuse is everywhere, and so what that tells me is the stories are not getting past a certain point in your process. And, so much of who we share our story with and whether a story is heard or not relies on relational trust. And if male leaders in the church have deeper relational trust with the men in their church than they do with the women, which I would expect is almost always the case, then it means when the man gives his side of the story, you're more likely to believe him than you are the woman when she gives hers, because you probably know what his favorite sports team is, and you probably know what his hobbies are, and you've probably shared meals together and golf or whatever, and her, you don't know anything about her. And so there's a huge credibility gap there. And so you either need to be a person who's more comfortable developing relationships, warm, appropriate relationships with the women in your church beyond what most people would say is, appropriate for erring on the side of caution, my least favorite term in this conversation. Or you need to have female advocates who are available to help in these times. Now, I will say that just having a female advocate doesn't mean that you have a trust level with the female advocate to the same degree that you do with the men who might be speaking into the process. So whoever the female advocates are, they need to have your trust and your respect, and they need to be trained. They need to understand how to have a trauma-informed response. And so it's complex.
Here's a practical example that I don't really know how to deal with, or just how I should handle it. I've been an elder for a long time in a large church, and I would say often about 2/3 of the women, large numbers of new members who are coming in are young single women. What does it look like for me to shepherd them? What does that look like? I know it's probably different from how I would be shepherding a 23-year-old man in some ways. By necessity, I think it would have to be different in some ways.
Kori and I would like to know how.
Well, I don't really know.
Are you going on campouts with the 23-year-old?
I would be on a men's retreat, and I would get a chance on a men's retreat to have focused time that I wouldn't have. I don't have a lot of focus time in general with your average 23-year-old male, but I would have something like that in a men's ministry context where I could do that. So that's why I'm wondering, what does it look like, otherwise to do that?
I was really blessed. The gospel was given to me by 2 campus male ministers, and one of them subsequently discipled me. So I got one-on-one time with my campus minister all the time. We had weekly meetings. Because of his input in my life, I quickly rose into leadership, which really gave me a hard look at myself and my things that I struggled with. So I got accountability. And those things are just pure discipleship. Those aren't gender specific. Being taught the word of God, being held accountable for my actions, being given a vision and helping me pray through that vision and see what the Lord may do. But then also what Stephen did really well was that there was no control. And that was something that I realized when I got into other discipleship relationships, I'm quicker to catch on to when someone's trying to mold me or shape me in a way that's nefarious versus something that's healthy. So I would, if I walked into a church and I was a young 23-year-old woman and I had an older brother who had a wealth of knowledge and I was theologically minded and wanted to know the word of God, I probably honestly don't want to talk about women things. I probably want to talk about the word of God, and I probably have specific questions with you and want to dig in just like any male would. And I was just really blessed to have
Actually, that's one of the key things I think is missing in the whole conversation is that when lots of times when pastors think about discipling a woman in their church and they're like, I don't know if I should do that. Part of the reason they make that is because they assume that the topic has to be about womanhood or about female stuff or about things like that. And this is one of the things that I don't get, that paradigm problem. Why wouldn't you just talk to them about Jesus and the gospel and the word and biblical theology and sound doctrine and basic discipleship categories? So it seems like there's a sense in which when a pastor pastors a male, he thinks in theological categories. When he moves over to pastoring a female, he thinks, oh, now it's relational categories, and I'm not equipped for that. So I just do the males and I don't do the women. But I think that's itself the problem, is that why would we assume that women don't need those same categories? And I think that's exactly maybe what you were describing, is that you got the benefit of someone who just wanted to talk to you about the gospel, which is like, wow, how about that? I mean, that seems like an obvious thing.
I think, Mike, it's also because we're professors. Meaning that there are certain people gravitate toward us. There are a lot of men in my church that they don't really care about theology.
Fair enough.
And they don't seek me out. And as I'm thinking about my own question in there, I'm realizing it has happened a lot. It's often classes, in classroom settings. You've talked about the importance of those classroom settings in the church. And so it's worked there. And then that translates into our professional space. And then it has often worked in home groups as well, where there have been a number of women that I've led to the Lord and have become very dear to me and our family from there. But it's usually been I guess I didn't realize how much of that was already happening in a group context that then spun off a level of trust for personally and then as a group that led to a lot of discipleship.
Well, and I think we're back to Genesis chapter 2. If you lead with difference, then it means you objectify someone into a category.
As soon as you see a female, you're like, I don't see a Christian. I see a female. And obviously you don't want to discount the fact that they're female because God's made them that way too. But that the common ground is you start with the common ground.
If you lead with sameness, then that's different. And, I think we forget, I have more in common with Mike Kruger than I have with a female cat. It is not my femaleness. It is my defining feature, It's my humanness. It's our shared humanness. And I think that's something we've lost sight of in the local church. We do have a men are from Mars, women are from Venus mentality a lot of times. And then there's the underlying narrative of, well, won't someone think this is sketchy? If I'm meeting with a woman to disciple her. And certainly there are sketchy ways you could do that. But the sheer number of non-sketchy ways that you could also do that boggles the mind. And I think we've lacked creative imagination, or the sheer number of places where you could have that discipleship relationship and no one question whether it's inappropriate or not. And that's what I think I'd love to see us reclaim, because when a father disciples a daughter, there's no script running around, is this appropriate or not? When a brother or sister are interacting with one another, there's no script about inappropriateness. And we have, I believe in many cases, we have taken in the hypersexualization of the culture and said, yep, we're going to buy into that too. And I think if the local church can't reclaim the beauty of male-female interaction along appropriate lines, what hope does the culture have? And we also cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that 2 men meeting alone can be every bit as inappropriate as a man and a woman meeting alone. We should say that. I don't think it's I don't think women should have to carry this burden around all the time that we're a particular risk category when it comes to relationship forming.
That's a good clip right there.
Don't you clip that, you son of a gun.
We're going to clip that. Is there an above reproach element that I do need to be mindful of?
Yeah, don't be an idiot is what I always say.
Well, I have problems not being an idiot.
You have to know your own weaknesses. But in my experience, most men in a position of authority are not avoiding meeting with women because they're afraid they'll accidentally have an affair. It's because they're afraid of perception.
Okay.
And that's different, right? And so that means you have to ask, well, then how can I mitigate the perception problem as far as possible so that people don't look at what I'm doing and think, that's sketchy. It matters how healthy your marriage is. There are a lot of factors to take into consideration. But when our default setting is too dangerous.
I know we're coming up on time, but just very two quick ones is public. I mean, when I met with Stephen, it was all the time on campus, in public settings, at coffee shops. When we did go to his home, if we were there for alone, it was for maybe a moment or two before somebody else came over. It wasn't like long, drawn-out conversations. But then also something I do is when I have relationships with men, I have quite a few pastors and men in my life, I'm oftentimes group texting with their wife. So I'll text the pastor and the wife, and usually the wife just stops texting. That means she doesn't want to be a part of the conversation anymore, and she trusts me with her husband. So it's like you're going to, be respectful. But that's not the goal here. My goal is to grow in Christ, and is to get a wisdom from my brother. And I feel like wives, and they understand that.
We acknowledge it as a factor, but we don't make it the standard.
And there are all sorts of other ways where it can go wrong, not just with an older man with a younger woman. All sorts of different
people
other
are crazy
ways as well. Yeah. Yep. Well, because they're people.
Right.
Not because they're men and women.
Right.
Because they're people.
Right.
Let's close by any other positive examples where you see this working well.
I'll give you a positive example historically. I mean, and I'm going to talk about this in my session this afternoon, and this is well known. Everyone at this table knows it. But when you think about what's a good example of a pastor showing great relations with women historically in a way that he knows their names, he knows their ministries, he encourages them. And I have to say the Apostle Paul is that. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds crazy because people are like, whoa, not Paul. Paul's the problem, right? Some will say.
Paul's the Ephesians 5 guy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you got to look at the whole picture of Paul, right? And the passage, of course, I'll be looking at this afternoon is Romans 16 in the final greetings, where it's his longest final greeting, which is probably the reason it skipped over most, because he has so many names. But nearly half the names are female. And not only are they female names, but he mentions their involvement in ministry, mentions his relationship with them, mentions how he'd been blessed by them, even at one point saying, then she was a mother to me, to one of the women in the list, and talks about how they're hosting churches in their homes, how they're doing this, how they're doing that. So here's a guy who clearly has healthy, positive relationships with women, knows their names, encourages them, and even praises them in this letter. Mm-hmm. That's not everything that can be said about the way a pastor can do their work, but man, if a pastor did one thing, know the women's names, know what ministry they're doing, and encourage them in their ministries, wow, that would be a milestone. You don't have to, if you just did that, you would find such a healthy response amongst the women in your church. If you just knew them, knew what their ministries were, and encourage them in their ministries, I think you'd find a lot of things would fall into place.
At ARC in DC, the Beat Annual Relay does this really well. He meets with the older women in his church who all have some type of responsibility within the church, and so he's oftentimes discipling them to disciple. And so there's a real relationship of a pastor knowing the concerns of the women of his church, knowing it from the woman's perspective, having that trusted relationship. So if something happens, he's quickly able to adjust or to move. So I think him and his elder board do a really good job of highlighting women, making sure that they're identified in the church, training them up, and then making sure that they can serve within the church and outside of the church with their gifts.
Yeah. I've challenged the guys at the church that I've served at. I'll say, hey, who's had name 3 people who've had the greatest impact on your faith? And typically they name all men. And then I'll just say, it's not wrong. It's not a wrong answer. But I'll say, what if you had a woman on that list and not your mom? Like, who would you put? And then say, if you don't know the answer to that, why don't you try to figure out the answer to that? And there's been a lot of fruit that's come from that. I think a lot of it is just we haven't even allowed ourselves to conceive of what it would like to have a mother in the faith if you're a son in the church, or what it would look like to operate as brothers and sisters instead of as two risk categories. And we have seen a lot of fruit from this in my local church. And we found out that it was a more beautiful story to tell than the story that is told in a lot of local churches. And it's been a church that I have been thrilled to raise my children in, because that's what I want them to see, is that the church is actually the true and better family. It's what if you had a great nuclear family, it's what that whispered toward. And if you had a terrible nuclear family, it's what you knew you needed as a result. And that happens when we function as mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. It's the more beautiful story.
Do they, would those names be older women in the congregation or authors? Or
it could be either. I would say all of us know that we have been mentored from afar and we've been mentored in person. I don't think we have to feel like it's wrong that, just to give an obvious, like that Augustine shaped your faith, no one's saying that's terrible. There will always be people from afar, and there should also be people who who are embodied too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like ending there. Thank you guys for talking on Partners in Ministry, how men and women must labor together for the good of the church. Normally when I've done these panels over the years at the Gospel Coalition, it's John Piper who always hates my titles. So Jen, now you joined the list who correct my questions and titles. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys, for venturing into some difficult ground, but trust it's been a helpful conversation for others as it has been for me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Gospel Coalition Podcast. Check out more gospel-centered resources at thegospelcoalition.org.